Welcome to Anews. I'm Melissa Chol and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. As global tensions intensify, the United States is redefining its role across multiple flashpoints, from Ukraine and Syria to Iran and Gaza. In today's episode, we'll break down the impact of Washington's halt in military aid to Kyiv, Trump's decision to lift sanctions on Syria, and Iran's escalating standoff with the IAEA. We'll also look at the chances of a 60-day ceasefire holding in Gaza amid diplomatic pressure, aid crisis, and political turmoil in Israel. Joining me today to discuss this and more are Daily Sabah's editorial coordinator, Dr. Mehmet Çelik, and political analyst Javed Rana. But let's first start off with our news package.
Palestinians in Gaza on Wednesday surveyed the aftermath of an Israeli strike on a tent encampment in Khan Yunis. Gaza health officials said at least 20 Palestinians were killed in separate Israeli attacks in the north and south. The latest deaths come after U.S. President Donald Trump announced Israel had agreed to conditions to finalize what he characterized as a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza. The president did not specify those conditions and included a threat. He wrote on Truth Social, quote, "I hope, for the good of the Middle East, that Hamas takes this deal, because it will not get better. It will only get worse." A Hamas official declined immediate comment on Trump's statement. A statement from the group said it was reviewing new ceasefire proposals from mediators, aiming for an agreement that would end the Gaza conflict and ensure the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the enclave. For some of the over 2 million Palestinian residents in Gaza, most of whom have been repeatedly displaced by the fighting, a proposed ceasefire is welcome news. Here is Samir Shaheen in Khan Yunis.
We hope this decision happens as soon as possible, because frankly, we are tired and have had enough of the injustice and the genocide we're being subjected to.
But Adnan al-Assar said Palestinians have heard such proposals before.
We hope he's honest this time. We're used to him not being honest in previous times. We hope he's serious, like he was serious during the Israeli-Iranian war, when he said the war should stop, and it stopped. Trump can stop the war if he wants to.
Israel's subsequent invasion of Gaza has killed more than 56,000 Palestinians, most of them civilians, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Previous ceasefires have seen short-term respites from the fighting, the freeing of Israeli hostages, and the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Hamas has said it is willing to free its remaining hostages in Gaza under a deal to end the war. Israel says the war can only end if Hamas is disarmed and dismantled. Hamas refuses to lay down its weapons.
So we are going to talk about it and more. As I mentioned, Dr. Mehmet Çelik is with us today. Well, thank you so much once again for joining us here on Anews. I know that you are here more than I am normally, but let's talk about what is going on with Trump. There's a lot is on his plate, actually. We were going to talk about Ukraine, but first off, I really want to ask you about the Gaza situation, because he was talking about the 60-day ceasefire deal and he was urging Hamas to take a step and agree with it. He said Israel agreed to it in his terms, Donald Trump's terms again. So what would you say about this situation overall?
Well, first of all, I think, in the bigger picture, the fact that there is a talk about a ceasefire, it's good news. Nevertheless, I think the conditions attached to this ceasefire needs to be clear, and they need to be shared with the public, and Hamas needs to agree with that for the ceasefire to actually take place. But until we know what the conditions are, it is very difficult to actually assess it and evaluate whether this will hold or not, whether Hamas will abide by it, or whether it is just a ceasefire on paper, but really it serves only the agenda of the Israeli war cabinet. So we need to see, first of all, the conditions attached and what the ceasefire will mean for the Palestinians. Secondly, I think, when we talk about ceasefire or the U.S. intervention into this, when we look at, for example, the Gaza humanitarian fund and how the aid has been delivered, there's a lot of controversies about this aid delivery. So if the ceasefire is going to look like something that is similar to this aid program, I think it is going to be very controversial, and I'm afraid it will not hold. On the other hand, we in the previous ceasefires also, we have seen that the Israeli side did not really abide by this. And it was very, one-sided, really, ceasefire that gave Israeli side the time to carry out more attacks on the Palestinians. In addition to all this, unclear lack of transparency, what this will mean, etc., I think when we talk about U.S. involvement in this, since day one, we've said that if anyone is going to be putting pressure on Netanyahu and actually have a working ceasefire, that will be the U.S. president. U.S. President Biden, former president, didn't do anything like that. His influence in this war wasn't actually helping to achieve a ceasefire or delivery of humanitarian aid or a peace in the end. But Trump is more involved in the Middle East. We see that with how he wants to turn this, for example, Iran and Israel conflict into a show for himself, to show that he was able to have this glow stick and basically bring the conflict to an end. I think he wants to have a similar show for Gaza as well. But Gaza is not what's happening in Gaza, what's taking place, the genocide there. The problem itself is actual, when we look at the deep-rooted causes, it's not like the Iran-Israel conflict. There's more to it, and it's not a problem that could be easily solved when Israel is carrying out this genocide, when Israel is spreading the war to the region, when some of the members from the cabinet, from the parliament, Israeli parliament, have been putting pressure on Netanyahu to actually annex the West Bank even. So, that pressure from the United States, if it is there, when there is so much pressure from the Israeli lobby on Trump, we will see how that will turn into something more tangible to actually achieve a ceasefire. But without U.S. pressure, without U.S. involvement, Netanyahu sees nobody else as an actor who can put pressure on him and stop the expansionist policies or the genocide taking place in Gaza or the occupation in the Palestinian territories.
Well, when we consider all of these together, actually, as you mentioned, there's so much to look for Donald Trump's perspective. As you mentioned again, that if there's someone who can stop the Israeli oppression, it is probably the United States president. And given the fact that Donald Trump excessively said that he wants to stop wars in his second term, and he is intending on it, and he was talking about he can end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. It didn't happen, of course, but he initiated some. So it's like I'm jumping around the topics from the topics, but I think they're all connected to one another under the theme of Donald Trump's attempt to do something about different kind of stuff. So when we consider all of these, what would you say about the situation that is unfolding in Ukraine right now? Because there's yet another shift that is happening after NATO. So when we consider the perspective of the United States, they are having a quite big shift from what happened with the Biden administration for their support, the military support actually for Ukraine. So they're withdrawing. Do you think that Europe is going to be able to fill that gap fast enough? Or do you think that they're going to yet another a power struggle in between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we know that the U.S. is undergoing a very major policy shift, but this is not a quick one and not a short-term one. And not one that is rushed. What I mean by that is to eliminate some of the problems in the Middle East, to eliminate the burden the U.S. has from the Ukraine war and shift its sole focus to Indo-Pacific region. This is, I think, in the long term, what is the U.S. foreign policy will look like. Nevertheless, with all the interventions in the Middle East, as we just mentioned with Iran and Israel, and also with removal of some of the aid, military aid from Ukraine, I think this shift is unfolding now towards Indo-Pacific. Of course, they are mentioning that it's due to low stockpiles, and Ukraine is not the only country that is going to basically suffer from this. There's other countries that the U.S. will also eliminate some of that, will recalculate and reassess their military aid to the other countries as well. Nevertheless, whether U.S. removal from Ukraine will mean something for the fate of this conflict, it is something that time will show, because of course this is leaves Ukraine more. This leaves Ukraine more vulnerable in face of Russian aggression and Russia's expansions and Russia's gains. But if the United States is not there, it is hard for Europe to actually fill that gap in the short term. Europe does not have the capacity to fill that gap, despite the fact that some countries like Germany and Denmark and the UK are intensifying their defense spending and also support to Ukraine. In the long term, I think what the United States is trying to do with Europe is to, in a way, leave it alone so that they can actually learn to survive on their own. Because without U.S. support, European security architecture will have a big void and big gap for their deterrence power. U.S. has historically played a big role in making sure that European security architecture is solidified in face of threats against the Western alliance or NATO alliance. If that is not in place, Europe will have to reconstruct itself and reevaluate how they're going to strengthen their deterrence capability. With Ukraine, I think when we look at the majority of aid comes from United States as a sole country. About 25%, I believe, is from Europe and other countries, and some of it is homegrown by Ukraine. So the U.S. chunk, if it is eliminated, it will leave a big empty space. So I think that whether the European side will be able to quickly fill that or not, it is something that time will show, and I don't think they're able to do that in the very short term. But U.S. is undergoing this policy shift, and I think when Trump wants to shift its focus, his focus from Ukraine, Middle East to Indo-Pacific, he does it he does it very quickly. Yeah. He does it without necessarily calculating short-term cost. He does, of course, the U.S. foreign policy is not solely based on Trump's decisions. I mean, there is an establishment, there is different apparatuses that calculate and reassess and evaluate what these moves will mean. But Trump, I think, rushes when he makes these calculations. So for that reason, in the short term, it will be hard to fill the gaps that the U.S. would pull when the U.S. pull out from Ukraine military aid. And I'm not sure if the European countries are ready to or prepared to fill that gap yet.
Well, actually, when we talk about, as you mentioned, it is a quite rushed decisions, that is series of decisions that is coming from Donald Trump during the course of his presidency. And when we talk about them, it is like we need to look at the perspective from the 360 degrees way, because the way that Donald Trump is shifting everything in the U.S. policy changes everything in the world as well, because the United States is such a critical partner for all the countries in the world. So when we look at all of these, I want to ask you one final question about Syria, because we have spoken about the Gaza, we have spoken about Ukraine, and lastly, the situation in Syria is also shifting. The perspective on Syria is also shifting from the Donald Trump's perspective. He has lifted the sanctions, he stated, and from then on, we are seeing a gradual but sure difference between the relationship, between the talks at least, not just the relationship is not forming right now, but the talks about Syria is shifting. What do you foresee about the future of this?
Well, first of all, as you know, this announcement of Syria sanctions came when Donald Trump was in Riyadh and he was meeting Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara and Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And Mr. Erdogan was also actually engaged in that meeting through a telephone call. And he said, you know, after the talks with Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Mohammed bin Salman, he decided to lift the sanctions on Syria. Now, I think in the face of this decision, we see that he wants to he wants to make it look like he wants to give a chance to to the Syrian administration and give them a chance to rebuild, reconstruct their country, because without removal of sanctions from United States and the European countries, it's hard for even the third parties to engage and involved in the reconstruction of the country at many levels, be it infrastructure, be it financial transactions, be it institutional rebuilding. The Syria needs a lot of help. For that to happen, I think that economic activity, trade activity, political engagement, humanitarian aid, and many different levels of engagement needs to happen with Syria, and removal of sanctions will facilitate that. I think the United States wants to see different actors engage with Syria for that reconstruction. As without lifting sanctions, this is impossible. But I think on the bigger picture, when we hear about, for example, Syria and Lebanon involving in Abraham Accords,
yep.
I think this is something bigger than just removal of sanctions for reconstruction of the country. Of course, that is a very basic need and the most perhaps pressing need when it comes to rebuilding a state that has been has been facing with war for past over a decade, basically. But I think when we look at the broader region, the implication of this is that it will facilitate a normalization of ties between United States and Syrian regime, between Israel and even the Syrian regime. It will have larger implications for region, and what this will mean in relations with Israeli government. And I think Trump wants to facilitate that normalization with the removal of sanctions. When the sanctions are removed, he will ask, what are you going to do for me, really? How are you going to engage with me? And the actors that I see as important. And Trump is, I think, in the bigger picture, is looking at that rather than short-term effects of course, the very needed removal of sanctions for rebuilding purposes.
Well, what is going on in the Middle East is so fragmented that when we try to talk about something else comes up entirely. So we need probably hours to talk about it. Now I'm going to drag the conversation back into Gaza because we have a news footage. Being a major hospital in Gaza has been forced to suspend critical treatments amid a worsening fuel crisis, leaving patients in urgent need and staff calling for immediate aid. Let's take a look and we'll be back.
The Shifa Hospital in Gaza City suspended services at the dialysis unit amid a shortage of fuel required to operate power generators. The health ministry said in a statement that the hospital, the main medical facility in the northern half of the strip, was forced to limit its services to the intensive care unit, warning that this would last for a few hours.
أنا بغسل كلى هلا بسبب إنه فيش سولار وفيش مية فإحنا توقفت غسيل الكلى هلا إحنا من دون الغسيل السموم كتير بتعلى عنا وسوائل بننخنق ما بنقدر ننام ما انسداد شهية نقدرش نتحرك هذا إشي صعب كتير.
The health ministry called for international agencies to press Israel to quickly allow the delivery of fuel to Shifa and other overwhelmed hospitals across Gaza. Many of the kidney patients were waiting at the dialysis ward, some fanning themselves amidst the sweltering heat.
احنا برضو يعني بدنا حد يطلع لنا يعني احنا برضو مرضى وبدنا رعاية صحية بدنا رعاية نفسية بدنا رعاية لكل شيء وانت شايف الوضع يعني احنا نفسيا تعبانين جسديا تعبانين صحيا اقول لك غذائيا والله غذاء كمان ما فيش انت شايف الوضع كيف بغزة.
So that was our news footage. Now we're going to take a look at what actually Daily Sabah has published today. Now, the headlines of Daily Sabah is Erdogan praises Gaza's brave women. We were talking about Gaza earlier. Now, let's talk about it. Addressing a convention of his party's women's branch yesterday, President Erdogan hailed Palestinian women resisting in the face of Israel's attacks in emotionally charged speech. It was quite emotional, as your newspaper has highlighted it. So what would you say about his speech overall, and how does it differ from the other stances of the other world leaders?
Well, first of all, we know that Mr. Erdogan has the Gaza and Palestine in general has a very special place in Mr. Erdogan's agenda, Mr. Erdogan's heart, and Mr. Erdogan's mind, and his view for the region and the world peace. So this has been a very constant position for Mr. Erdogan. He has been one of the most advocates in all international platforms, and he's the one that consistently brings this Gaza genocide and the humanitarian crisis there in all international platforms. Yesterday, he was talking to his party's women's branch, hundreds of members he was addressing to, and he brought this, the struggle, the resistance of Palestinian women in face of the Israeli genocide. He said, these are women who, I'm going to quote him actually, these are women who hid their tears while embracing their loved ones, wrapped in a shroud. Because Palestinian women, they have been saying, we are going to fight for freedom, we are going to fight for liberation, we are going to fight for this occupation to end from our lands, from our homes, as they are burying their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their children, who are still, they're not able to talk, they're babies. So their stance is very, I think it's a very historic and legendary and a magnificent stand in face of the aggression, in face of the genocide taking place, instead of a military that has been attacking them without any rules, without respect for any international law, any international human rights law, without, as they are committing war crimes, these women are standing strong in face of this aggression. And I think, he was saluting their resistance. He was saluting their very, I think, holy position in face of this aggression, because it is not easy for any human being to suffer much longer in face of these atrocities and still stick to their homeland. They hold their position as they are putting their children into the graves. So, I mean, what they have actually instilled in the lines of today's history will be remembered, I think, as a legend, as a women's movement in face of this struggle, and we are facing this right now as the genocide is. We're watching it as the genocide is taking place, but history is recording this. This will be remembered, and I think it's a very, very respectful position, very respectful stance that they are actually putting forward. But this is not something that should be ignored. This is not something that the world should turn a blind eye to. When you asked me about the other world leaders, when they are always talking about women's rights, when they're always talking about humanitarian rights, when they're always talking about international humanitarian laws and democracy and freedoms, they ignore the killings of children in Palestine. They ignore the killing of women in Palestine. They ignore the killings of medics, bombing of hospitals and schools in Palestine. They turn a blind eye to killing of journalists. Hundreds of journalists have been killed, and they keep talking about press freedom while ignoring what's taking place in Palestine. And this is why we carried this issue to our headline for today's paper.
But it's such an hypocrisy, isn't it, when you point it out like this? I mean, we do hear a lot more stories coming from the women in Palestine, and each story is more devastating than the last. And when we thought that this is it, we can't go any devastating from that, but always somehow manages to break our hearts even more.
Over 57,000 people have been officially, as the official number, they've been killed, and there's maybe tens of thousands of more still under the rubble.
Yeah.
This is not just a number. These are not just statistics. These are people like you and I, like every other world citizen, that they have stories, they have families, they have had a dream for a future, but now they're facing the atrocities and this genocide taking place in Gaza.
Whenever we talk about, I'm going to let you finish, but whenever we talk about the women in Palestine, I remember the mothers who boil the pasta long enough so that they can make a bread out of it because their kids are craving for bread. So this is kind of story that you cannot make up in the fiction.
I mean,
this
famine is used.
Happening here.
Famine is used, or hunger is used as a weapon.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is we can talk about it for much longer, but I think our time.
Yeah.
We need to get back to other issues as well.
Yeah, well, that is precisely why Daily Sabah has carried this important issue to their headlines today, and we are going to continue talking about it. But now we have another important issue in our hands, and we are going to talk about the U.S. missile shipments. We have a news footage about that. Let's take a look, and we'll be back.
The Pentagon has halted some shipments of air defense missiles to Ukraine. Sources familiar with the decision said on Tuesday. Other precision munitions are also affected, prompted by concerns that US stockpiles are too low. The sources said it amounts to the slowing of some weapons shipments promised to Kyiv by former President Joe Biden's administration. Air defense interceptors to help knock down Russian drones and projectiles were said to be among the items delayed. In recent weeks, Russia has intensified air attacks on Ukraine's cities on several nights, launching hundreds of drones and missiles at a time, leading to widespread damage and an increase in civilian casualties. Fedor Venislavsky, a member of the Ukrainian Parliament's National Security and Defense Committee, called the decision painful, though he was hopeful of a resolution.
This decision is certainly very unpleasant for us. It's painful, and against the background of the terrorist attacks which Russia commits against Ukraine, against peaceful towns, cities, villages, citizens of Ukraine that die almost every day from such terrorist attacks.
In Kyiv, people on the street met the news with resignation.
It's the choice of the US, so be it. This cannot be a reason for us to let our hands down and not continue fighting until the end.
Since US President Donald Trump took office in January, he has softened Washington's position toward Russia. He has sought a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine and raised doubts about future US military support for Kyiv's war effort. Ukraine is already experiencing a shortage of 155mm ammunition used for artillery on the front lines, said one Ukrainian defense source. However, last week, Trump said he was considering selling more Patriot air defense missiles to Ukraine, following a meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart, President Volodymyr Zelensky. Russia, which already controls about a fifth of Ukraine, has been preparing a summer ground offensive, advancing gradually in parts of the east and northeast. In an email, the Pentagon said it was providing Trump with options to continue military aid to Ukraine, in line with the goal of ending Russia's war there, but no new policy has been announced.
Now we have our guest, political analyst Javed Rana, is joining us to discuss the further details of this news package that we have seen. Javed, thank you so much for joining us, sparing your time once again.
Thank you.
Well, let's start by Trump's presentation of the 60-day ceasefire deal as his best and final offer. What are the chances Hamas will accept these terms given their demands for a full Israeli withdrawal?
I think Hamas has indicated that they are going to accept this particular ceasefire deal, but obviously they have their own terms and conditions. Traditionally speaking, their terms and conditions have been the complete withdrawal of Israel's soldiers from the Gaza. And more importantly, I think Hamas wants the release of all the Palestinian prisoners. And in the return of that, they are willing to release all of the Israeli prisoners in their custody. Now I think Hamas is essentially being bullied, being pressured, being people in Gaza being killed, and that is a bigger pressure on Hamas. And my understanding is that probably there are two options right now. The one option is that if Hamas is pushed to the wall, which it has already been pushed to the wall, and the pressure is somewhat on a tipping point, there is a possibility that Hamas would set some of the prisoners free. I mean, these Israeli prisoners. And in return of 60 days ceasefire, and obviously in return they will get some number of Palestinian prisoners from Israel custody. This is a kind of a short-term arrangement that is a likely possibility. But having said that, the bigger picture is, my understanding is that despite the fact that Donald Trump has been putting a lot of pressure on Hamas, despite the fact that Donald Trump has been threatening Hamas, my understanding is that behind the scene, during his expected meeting with Netanyahu in Washington, he is going to push for a bigger permanent ceasefire. There are credible reports coming from Israel's newspapers suggesting that probably now Donald Trump wants to reactivate Abraham Accord. And they want to hand over the control and the administration of Gaza to Egypt and probably also UAE. Now they are very trustworthy allies behind the scene of Israel. I think that possibility is there. But again, there will be obviously resistance from Palestinian Authority. There would be obviously resistance from Hamas. They want their own indigenous setup. They want that there has to be technical expertise to run Gaza. And for that to happen, I think there appears to be consensus among all factions of Palestinians where they would be willing to have some kind of a setup where Palestinians are representing. UAE is not involved, Egypt is not involved, and for that matter, any other third Arab country is not involved. But again, this is something easier said than done. We have to see that at this particular point of time, Netanyahu is facing very hard time from the opposition. His trial is already there. So he may not be able to go ahead with his own agenda, which includes that he wants to eliminate Hamas altogether in Gaza, something unlikely to happen.
Well, with over 56,000 deaths in Gaza and rising civilian tolls at the lines, how meaningful is a temporary ceasefire without structural reform and aid distribution, in your opinion?
I think the structural reforms are must. And those structural reforms obviously means that 1967's the borders which existed before 1967's war, and there is international consensus about the two-state solution. Now, the problem is that Netanyahu has worked over the decades, particularly during last 2 years, to make it sure that there is the possibility of two-state solution ceases to exist. And that is why we have seen that a significant territory in occupied West Bank has already been taken over by the settlers. There are 700,000 settlers who are armed. Every next day, they've been occupying more and more territory. So their declared objective is to basically also take over entire West Bank because of the religious agenda they've been following. And then I think so far as Gaza is concerned, my understanding is that there is no possibility that Netanyahu would accept any form of rule of Hamas in Gaza. So I think the greater possibilities are that there could be a consensus whereby some Palestinian leaders who are not very controversial, and they form a government, and they are backed by the Arab countries. But again, the bigger reforms have to be there deep inside the apartheid state, where it has an expansionist agenda, and I think they've been killing people, and this genocide is unending. And I don't foresee that if Netanyahu is allowed to stay in office, because for whatever domestic reasons, there is a possibility that whatever the remains of Palestinians are in Gaza, I think those would also be eliminated in ongoing genocide.
Well, Jawad, let's talk about diplomatic leverage as well. Do Qatar and Egypt truly hold in finalizing this deal? And how might their involvement shape regional dynamics, in your opinion?
Well, again, this is something easier said than done. But right now, the biggest issue for Netanyahu was Iran. And now the myth of Israel being so-called policeman in the Middle East, that has been shattered by the Iranian retaliation. So therefore, now everybody in Washington realizes that Netanyahu has been aggravating the situation. There has to be a solution. Therefore, now the political dynamics in the Middle East have changed altogether. Therefore, I think there is a greater possibility that Donald Trump, during upcoming visit of Netanyahu to Washington, he is going to put more pressure on Netanyahu to accept some kind of a permanent ceasefire, to accept some kind of arrangement, alternative arrangement in Gaza. And more importantly, then there would be a lot of hue and cry, a lot of sloganeering about reactivating Abraham Accord. And under that accord, two countries are extremely important, with which apartheid Israel wants to normalize diplomatic ties, and that is Pakistan, a nuclear armed state, and Saudi Arabia, which is perceived to be, given the fact it has a huge significance in the Muslim countries because it is a custodian of the two holy sites. So I think the bigger picture again here is that Netanyahu would not accept two-state solution, no matter what happens, as long as he's there as a prime minister. So I think it all also depends on his ongoing trial in the court on the bribery charges, on corruption charges. And he was indicted back in 2019, and there has been a lot of delay because of political reason in this trial. In the conclusion of this trial, I think if this trial is concluded, or for some other reason, if he's not allowed to stay in the office and there is a new prime minister, some kind of possibility is there that there may be a kind of a movement towards two-state solution. But that would be more for public consumption, basically to cool down public temperature on the streets in Pakistan and also in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Muslim countries. But I don't foresee that this two-state solution would be so easy at a time when Donald Trump, right from the day one, along with Netanyahu, they've been doing everything where the two-state solution seems to be ceasing to exist. Again, we have to see that it was Abraham Accord, of which Donald Trump is a founding father. That was a core reason which led Hamas to carry out a much bigger military operation inside apartheid Israel. So if there is no fair treatment of Palestinians, if there is any normalization of diplomatic ties by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia without a genuine two-state solution, that means the Palestinians will feel left out, and there could be another October 7, 2023 like attack on Israel. And now, since Israel's myth has been already shattered, therefore I think it has become more vulnerable. There is obviously a pent-up anger. The people there are hundreds of thousands of people who have died. These are not just 56,000 according to different reports. Probably these people are still under the rebels. They have their leftover children. They will grow up. It's a matter of time. There would be another attack on Israel. Israel would not stay in peace. Israel has created far more enemies. Its myth of militarily its military myth has been shattered altogether. Again, the point I'm trying to make after its attack on Iran. And Iran would certainly go for a nuclear bomb. It is again a matter of time. So in the long run, it is apartheid Israel which is going to lose. We have seen also vibes in the West, more particularly in the USA. We have seen that now a pro-Palestinian Muslim candidate for the mayorship of the New York, he is most likely to win on pro-Palestinian sentiments. That is an indicator that in years to come, in the Western government would not be able to continue supporting apartheid Israel, given the fact that it has conducted an industrial scale of a genocide in occupied Gaza.
Well, Javed, thank you so much for your valuable answers, and we certainly do hope that the situation in Gaza unfolds for the best sooner than later. But as you mentioned, in the future times, maybe the hope will come. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Also, thank you so much, Dr. Mehmet Çelik, for joining us here on Anews once again. With that, we are bringing us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.